Hello, everyone. Welcome to Johnny's Ambassadors Expert Webinar Series for Parents. I am your host, Laura Stack, the founder and CEO of Johnny's Ambassadors. We work with parents and teens to help them understand the dangers of high THC marijuana on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide ideation. We have a very special guest with us today, whom I will introduce in just a moment to let you know that Dr. Stuyt will be taking questions after today's session. She will present slides for 45-50 minutes or so. So as you think of them, please type them into the question box so that I can read them off to her. So I am pleased to introduce, back by popular demand, Dr. Libby Stuyt, who is a board-certified addiction psychiatrist and has worked in the addiction and behavioral health field since 1990. She was the medical director for the Circle program, which was a 90-day inpatient treatment program funded by the state of Colorado for persons with co-occurring mental illness and substance abuse who had failed other levels of treatment. She retired from this position in 2020 and is currently motivated to educate as many people as possible on the unintended consequences seen from the commercialization of marijuana in Colorado, focusing primarily on the deleterious effects of high-potency THC on the developing brain and mental health. Libby, thank you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Okay, thank you. Well, greetings everyone and Happy New Year. Here's to hoping that 2021 is a healthy and productive year. All right, I'm going to talk mostly about the effects of high potency THC. But to start with, I just want to do a little history lesson review about what we're talking about. So we're basically talking about cannabis. I know you all know that, that's why you're here. And you know, cannabis has been around for centuries. So it's been used medicinally since 2000 BC or something. It's been around for a very long time. However, we did not really know why people liked cannabis until the 1960s. When this lab in Israel was working on all the different components of marijuana, all the different cannabinoids, and they found that when they injected THC into aggressive rhesus monkeys, that the monkeys became calm and sedate. And they identified that there was a receptor in the brain that THC fit into perfectly. And so sadly, they named it a cannabis receptor. I say that sadly because that has made everybody believe that we have a receptor in our brain that's meant for us to smoke cannabis, which isn't true, because it was that same exact lab that discovered why we have those receptors. So they discovered, basically, along with many other researchers around the world, that there are CB1 and CB2 receptors in our body. They're called cannabinoid receptors. And we create our own chemicals for these receptors. So they have discovered or helped us learn about the endocannabinoid system. So endo means in your body. And so it's our own natural system. And we create drugs for these receptors. Now, one of these drugs they named anandamide. Anandamide is a Sanskrit word for supreme joy or bliss, and it looks identical to THC. Now, the reality is our brain creates these chemicals when they're needed. So they're used immediately, they're used locally, so they're produced locally, they're used immediately, and then they're destroyed. THC is this fat-soluble substance that sits in that receptor and blocks our own natural chemicals from working in that receptor. Now, that has been, to me, the best thing that has come out of all the legalization of marijuana is this understanding of this endocannabinoid system. And what we now know is that this is our mood regulatory system. This is what balances us. So these CB1 receptors regulate the balance between our excitatory and our inhibitory neurons. And during adolescence, they play a really important role. And that's the most serious problem with adolescents or young people whose brains are still developing getting a hold of cannabis. Because your brain is not completely developed until mid-20s, and it is constantly developing from time of you were first in utero, and it continues to develop. During puberty is when the brain is making a lot of decisions about what neurons are we keeping and what neurons are we getting rid of. So what ones are we going to myelinate and strengthen so that they work really well, and what nerves are we going to prune? And this endocannabinoid system plays a big role in that. If you put an exogenous source of marijuana, THC, in this developing brain, you have no idea what you're doing to the developmental system. And these receptors are all over the brain. So they are involved in multiple different functions of our life, and it's our own natural chemicals that are supposed to be doing this. However, THC will fit in all these receptors and will affect negatively, potentially, all of these areas. Now, why this is so concerning right now is marijuana of today is not what it was in the past. Without any state government regulation here in Colorado, the cannabis industry has been allowed to increase the potency in marijuana to extreme proportions and call it medical so that children and adults believe that it's safe and it's good for them. This is a study just done back, a few years ago, showing that between 1995 and 2015, there was like a 212% increase in THC. Now that has continued. Because if you think about that marijuana of the previous times, so way back to 2000 BC, all the way up to the 1980s, the THC content in the plant was less than 2%. When we legalized medical marijuana in Colorado, the highest, and that was 2000, the highest THC concentration was 5%. In the plant, and there were no concentrates. So we voted on something that now happens that we didn't vote on. The concentrates began to appear in medical dispensaries in 2010. And then, of course, we legalized recreational in 2012. And this is from the most updated 2019 regulated marijuana market update. So this is the Marijuana Enforcement Division data, showing that back in 2014, when we had, all the stores open, the plant was ranging around 15% average. Now it's up to almost 20%, 18.8% THC. The concentrates back in 2014 were at about 40%, and now they're averaging almost 70%, with some going up to 95%. So there's been this massive increase in THC concentration. And I am not saying that there is nothing good about marijuana. There is research supporting the use of smoked cannabis for medical conditions, but all of that research has been done with THC less than 10% in the smoked plant. And most of the research has been done with cannabinoids, different versions of the plant, like, pharmaceutical grade things. Now, this is a big meta-analysis systematic review article that the National Academies of Science used to say that, yes, there was some benefit for some cannabinoid parts for medical. And as I said, it was all less than 10% in the smoked plant. This was an interesting study, just showing that when they thought, well, does it help with pain at all? They got these healthy volunteers to be willing to be injected with capsaicin in their forearm. Capsaicin is the stuff out of hot peppers, so apparently that's pretty painful. And they found that 2% THC, if they smoked it, provided no pain benefit. 4% actually significantly decreased the pain, while 8% resulted in an increased pain or hyperalgesia. And that's actually what we see with opiates. And that's why opiates are not a good solution for chronic pain. Now, if you make a drug more potent, you increase the addiction potential. And we know that absolutely about all drugs. If you think about nicotine is like the most addictive drug known to man. We now have Juuls, and a kid can smoke a Juul, and there's equivalent of 20 cigarettes in one Juul. That is extremely addicting. And the FDA has even been talking about reducing the nicotine content in tobacco. Hasn't happened, but they mentioned it. We know that 3-2 beer is not nearly addicting as vodka. Chewing the coca leaf is nothing like smoking crack cocaine. We've known this for a very long time with the opiates, that when they came out with the much more powerful, longer acting opiates, they were much more addicting. And we're seeing the same thing with marijuana, because back in the 60s to 80s, when it was less than 2%, we did not even think it was addicting. And so marijuana was classed in hallucinogen category because it caused hallucinations, but it doesn't cause addiction because there was no withdrawal associated with it. However, now with the very high potency THC, we are seeing significant addiction problems and withdrawal. And the marijuana withdrawal syndrome is pretty miserable. And this is what people experience when they become addicted to marijuana, and then they can't get it for whatever reason. And they have lots of anger, irritability, depression, and they have severe cravings for marijuana. The Netherlands has, they've been tolerant about marijuana for years. So they've been very tolerant, but even they recognized that when their potency in the plant got up to 20%, which is what ours is now, there was a lag time, but there was this increased need for admissions for treatment for cannabis use disorder. And they actually came out and said that they believe anything above 15% should be considered a hard drug. So they actually capped their potency at 15%. And with that, there's now a decrease in the need for cannabis use disorder treatment. However, in Colorado, pretty much everything that's available is greater than 15%. And this is true in both the medical and in the recreational. So there is very little of this, what is considered truly medicinal, available in any of the dispensaries. This was a study done by this independent group that went around the country looking at all the states that have legalized marijuana and looking at what was available in their dispensaries. And I want to point out that absolutely no research, any legitimate research, supports high potency THC concentrates like dab, shatter, wax, or high potency THC oil as safe or effective to treat any medically diagnosed condition. And if you look at the regulated marijuana market update report, we have increasing amounts of concentrates. So this is from 2014 to 2019. The percentage of the market share of concentrates has significantly increased, and it's higher in medical than it is in recreational. So we have 34% of the stuff available in medical is concentrates, and there is no data supporting that. These formulations can be up to 95% THC, and if you don't know how this is created, I've found that giving some talks to people, they're like clueless. They don't know exactly what shatter is. But normally people smoke the plant. So this is the joint, and they smoke the leaves or the bud. And you can smoke it in various ways, and you can vaporize it, and you can do all kinds of things. However, in order to get these high concentrates, they have to extract the oil. So what they do is they put the leaves that come off to the cutting of the buds to trim the buds and make them beautiful. And they have to add a solvent to extract the oil. And so they use solvents like butane or propane to extract the oil. And then they take the oil and they dry it. It kind of gets desiccated and it ends up looking kind of like peanut brittle. It breaks up into little pieces that you can then smoke, or it doesn't get completely dry and it looks a little waxy, or this is a dab. So this is a little concentrate that's stuck on a needle, and then you have to use very high intense heat to smoke this. So people are smoking it with a blowtorch to vaporize it so that you can then suck the vapor up into your lungs. And what we are seeing in Colorado is a significant increase in dabbing, which is this, and use of edibles by young people in Colorado, with the fact that we have now, what is very sad to me is we used to be the state with the lowest use of tobacco by any adolescent until the vape and electronic cigarettes came out. And now we are the highest state. Which is very sad. And you can put anything in a vape. So kids are using vapes to vape marijuana. And this is just showing that a more recent report that kids that report using electronic vape products, 50% of them report using marijuana in the past 30 days versus 7.6 for not using vape products. This is an example of what is available as, quote, medicine. So this is available in both medical and recreational dispensaries, and it's a bag of shatter. Now, interestingly, it's called Scooby Snacks, which to me only appeals to young people, but it has the list of all these ingredients, which include butane and propane, which are carcinogens. And the potency of THC is 76% THC with no CBD. This is very sad because the CBD is supposed to be the protective part of the plant. And when you make plants produce high amounts of THC, they cannot produce the CBD. Now, whoa, let's not go here. Sorry. There. Too many buttons. What I think is really important here is there's actually a disclaimer on the bag that the industry puts on there that it says there may be long-term physical and mental health effects from using marijuana. The thing that bothers me the most is they are able to put this on there that says this product was produced without regulatory oversight for health, safety, or efficacy, and yet it's in a medical dispensary. So how is that possible? How can we have this kind of product that has no oversight in a medical dispensary that then people think, oh, this must be safe, this must be good? And kids are increasingly using concentrates. So the most recent Healthy Kids Colorado survey, 2019, found that 10.2% of high school kids reported using dab. That's really concerning. And of those who admit using marijuana on a regular basis, 52% report dabbing. That's nearly a 70% increase in only 2 years. So where are they getting it? I think the industry likes to say they're getting it from their parents or they're getting it from the black market. I mean, that bag I showed you is clearly not the black market. That's from a dispensary. And one of the sources that many kids are getting these are through kids with 18 to 20 getting medical marijuana cards. Now in Colorado, you cannot purchase tobacco or alcohol until you're 21. But you can go to a doctor and get a medical card at 18 without any parental consent or knowledge and get a medical card and buy shatter. And so to me, it's very concerning. If you look at the CDPHE, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, Medical Marijuana Registry, there has been a significant increase in medical marijuana cards for this age group, 18 to 20. You can look back over the years. They only go back to like 2004, I believe. I can't remember. In terms of looking at how many people are on the registry every month. So it's updated every month. And for the kids 0 to 17, there's like 132 on the registry. So these are kids, like the youngest kids, 0 to 10, are getting them primarily for seizures. So they're getting the CBD form for seizures. And then the 10 to 17 are primarily for severe pain. And I can imagine that those are kids probably with some severe illness, like cancer or something that is causing them horrible pain and their life is awful. They are getting their medical marijuana. I do not understand how it can jump from at 17, 132 people to at 18, almost 4,000 kids getting medical cards. Now, I have been involved with several of these kids. I have seen or worked with the kids that are 18 getting cards, and they do not have what I would call a debilitating medical illness. Yeah, they have issues. They're getting cards for a migraine headache, a sprained ankle, low back pain, some kind of trauma that they've had. Those are not indications for debilitating illness, but physicians are giving them cards, and the physician does not give them a prescription, doesn't tell them what to go buy, what to use, how often to use, doesn't give them a follow-up appointment to see if it's working, like you would with any other medication. And the kids are going to the dispensary and buying things like wax, shatter, dab. And then they're sharing it. Like I'm working with a kid that got a card at 18 and was sharing it with his 14-year-old brother, and causing a horrible outcome. And another problem is the availability of dispensaries. So this is an independent researcher looking at all of the different states that have legalized medical and recreational, and the number of dispensaries per 100,000 people. And what they found was Colorado is the highest. So Colorado per 100,000. Here we go down to Washington, it's 3 per 100,000. Oregon is the next highest at 10 per 100,000. California isn't even close to us. However, this is what we're seeing. And not all counties or communities opted in to have dispensaries. So 70% of the counties in Colorado opted out. So there has to be a significantly higher percentage in some communities, which is like Pueblo. Pueblo has 37 dispensaries. And so that's 21 dispensaries per 100,000. And I was just talking to somebody from Trinidad who they have like a population of only like 6,000 people, and they have 30-something businesses of marijuana. So how is this impacting us? And I really think it's affecting our most vulnerable citizens. And I put in that babies in utero, children, adolescents, young adults whose brain is still developing up into the age of mid-20s, and people with addiction problems and people with mental health problems. These are our most vulnerable citizens to this. Number one, we know that the marijuana definitely can affect cognition. And so this is a study, a very large prospective study out of New Zealand, where they followed over 1,000 people. And they actually saw them at age 13 before they initiated cannabis and got an IQ test. And then they followed them. And the one that persisted to use marijuana actually had, at the repeat IQ test at 38 years old, had an 8-point drop in their IQ, whereas those people that didn't persist in using marijuana, their IQ was pretty stable. Now, this drop is significantly higher than what happens with lead. Lead was like a 2 to 3% decrease, and we got all bent out of shape about lead, which we should legitimately. But, you know, if you think about it, what does it mean to lose 8 points in your IQ? If you're at the average IQ, which is 100, so you're at the bell curve of IQ, if you lose 8 points, you're down to the 29th percentile. And that means you're less likely to function in life. You're less likely to have a good job, do well in pretty much anything. Then we see a significant increase in the risk of psychosis. There is even now this diagnosis called cannabis-induced psychosis, because this is happening with people who do not have a family history or a personal history of things like schizophrenia. They don't have the prodromal symptoms of schizophrenia before they start using marijuana. And so people are using marijuana in adolescence have a much higher risk of developing a psychotic disorder. And this was kind of the landmark study, and there have been many studies since all over the world looking at high potency, increasing the risk of psychosis. So what they did was they looked at people 18 to 65. So these aren't even teenagers here, with their first episode of psychosis, and then they had healthy controls. And they found that if the people were using their high potency, this was done in the UK, and they call their high potency skunk, which is greater than 15%. If they were using that form of marijuana, there was a 3 times increased risk of psychosis. If they were using it daily, there was a 5 times increased risk. But if they were using the stuff that was less than 5%, there was no risk for psychosis. This is similar data has been shown for addiction as well. So what we're seeing in Colorado, this is data out of Denver, that there has been an increasing need for kids going to emergency rooms and urgent care centers with cannabis as the reason they're showing up. And the biggest concern is this need for behavioral health evaluations. So it's getting to the point where almost 60% of the kids coming in need behavioral health evaluations because they're experiencing psychosis, depression, suicide, anxiety, panic attacks that is directly related to their marijuana use. Now, we in Colorado, as many states have added PTSD as an indication for using medical marijuana. And having treated many, many people with PTSD, I would not support this. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think there's any research yet that is showing that it is a good idea. This is a very big study showing that it probably is not a good idea. So this is an observational study of over 2,000 veterans who have been treated for PTSD in the veterans PTSD treatment program. So there's multiple programs around the country, and usually it's an inpatient treatment that's about a month long. And so they followed these veterans that went through the treatment for PTSD, and then they followed them for 4 months after treatment to see how they were doing. And they evaluated it based on how they were, if they were using marijuana or not. And so what they found was the people that never used marijuana had significantly lower symptom severity at 4 months, meaning that the treatment for PTSD was helpful. The stoppers, meaning people that had been smoking marijuana but quit when they went through treatment, had the lowest level of PTSD symptoms 4 months after treatment. But the people who started using marijuana after their treatment for PTSD had the highest level of violent behavior and PTSD symptoms 4 months after treatment. And the reason why I don't think marijuana is the answer for PTSD is, well, it works. It works, yes. If you have the symptoms of PTSD, it can numb you so the symptoms are gone. So if you are, kind of under the influence, the symptoms are not bothering you. However, this is only temporary relief. You're basically disconnected from the trauma and the emotions. But in order to keep those symptoms at bay, you have to use all day long, every day, which sets you up for cognitive impairment, amotivational syndrome, potential for addiction, psychosis, worsening psychosis from PTSD, because PTSD can cause psychotic symptoms. And it's a vicious cycle. So this is why the VA learned the hard way about benzodiazepines. They used to hand them out like candy for people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And now they're really minimizing the use of them, seeing that that is what happens. And the other interesting thing is there's some evidence now, some research showing that marijuana can actually create false memories. And I have seen that working with people who come in with severe trauma, a story that is severe and it sounds awful, and we're trying to help them with that. And then we find out from family members that what they're talking about never actually ever happened. And so that makes it very difficult to do treatment. It's also very much associated with violence. And this is very concerning. If you think about what I talked about in the very beginning, I talked about how the endocannabinoid system is our mood regulation system. So it helps us stay stable in our mood. If, for whatever reason, like you're using marijuana and you're stuck in a depressed state and you can't get out of it because the marijuana doesn't leave, and it also takes off your prefrontal motor cortex, because that's your decision-making part of your brain. And all addictive drugs do that, but marijuana definitely does. So it makes you not have good judgment, makes you not have good impulse control. So if you're miserable with no impulse control, I can see why you might be more potentially violent. And this is looking at psychiatric patients followed for 4 10-week time intervals after they've been discharged. So these are people that were in psychiatric hospitalization, and then they follow them based on what drug they start using afterwards and what the violent potential is. And this was done back in 92 to 95. So this is when we had like 4 to 5% THC. And what they found was the persistent cannabis use was associated with an increased risk of subsequent violence. So that's this line. Significantly more so than alcohol or cocaine, which is very interesting. And then this is just another study looking at people with early psychosis. And so they actually had psychotic symptoms. They were followed prospectively for 36 months. And then they were looked at whether they had presence of violence or not. And they found that cannabis use disorder was basically the strongest risk factor for violent behavior. And basically it was in the people that started using earlier. So it is, and they do point out, cannabis use is linked to impulsivity and lack of insight because it's throwing off your prefrontal motor cortex. So that's violence against others. There is violence against yourself, and there is high correlation now with marijuana and suicide. There have been multiple studies demonstrating this. This was just one very large study out of Australia and New Zealand, where they looked at over 2,000 adolescents and found that the frequency of marijuana use, so kids that were using marijuana on a regular basis, had 7 times increased risk in suicide attempts compared to the non-users. This is something that Christine Miller put together very nicely that kind of demonstrates how we've had this suicide happening in Colorado. You know, Colorado has always had one of the higher rates of suicide. It's kind of hard to understand because it's a really beautiful place, but we've always been higher than the national average. And if you look at this in terms of when we started, this is when we commercialized marijuana, because that's when the Obama administration came out and said they weren't going to prosecute anybody in a state that had medical law if they were following the law. So that's when that happened. And then we voted to legalize recreational, and then the dispensaries opened. And we're just seeing a progressive increase in suicide, and this is in the general population. And then if you look at these other reports, so this is back in 2017. This is the congressional hearing showing that veteran suicides have not decreased. They were up 32% since 2001, and compared to a national increase of 23%. And then most recently, 2020, the National Veteran Suicide Prevention Report from the Department of Veterans Affairs in Colorado, his rate is significantly higher than the national rate. And it was an all-time high and a 25% increase over 2018, which then puts this into perspective. So this was a study done with veterans with cannabis use disorder. And so basically these are veterans that have had trauma. This is over 3,000 veterans. And they found that those that were using cannabis to the point that they were addicted to it and had cannabis use disorder had much higher suicidal ideation and much higher lifetime suicide attempts than those that did not have cannabis use disorder. And this study controlled for many, many things, pretty much everything that would contribute to suicide. And then this is the most concerning thing, is what's happening with our teens and our young people. So this is a very large systematic review and meta-analysis of multiple studies. So over 23,000 kids. And the odds ratio for suicide attempts was 3.5 in terms of kids using cannabis than those not using cannabis. And we are seeing the same thing in Colorado. THC is the #1 drug found in teens who died by suicide in Colorado. And so this is specifically, I'm addressing the teens that are in high school, age 15 to 19. And this is directly from the Colorado Violent Death Reporting System. And it starts back, I can't go back further than this, but it's 2004. And so these are the kids 15 to 19 who have committed suicide in each of these years. And as you can see, there is clearly a significant increase in the number of teen suicides in Colorado in the last 5 years. So that's since we legalized recreational marijuana. One of the very concerning things is not all these kids are getting toxicology. Now, it used to be that pretty much most coroners were reporting toxicology. We now see coroners not reporting toxicology, and I've actually heard from a coroner saying that it was CDPHE told them not to report it, which doesn't make sense to me. Sure, it doesn't cause death. However, it's associated with death, and I think it would be very important to know this data. And so this is something that I think has to change. I do not know why people are not reporting toxicology, because as you can see, when toxicology is obtained, then marijuana is significantly the highest drug in these kids' suicide. And because what I talked about with the effect on the endocannabinoid system and how it affects your mood and your frontal cortex, I can see how it can totally be related to suicide. And marijuana has not decreased our opiate overdose deaths at all, no matter what the industry wants to say. If you look at this graph and go back to here, so this is in 2000 when we legalized medical marijuana. The highest potency in the plant, and we had no concentrates, was 5%. And this was the overdose rates for all of these different drugs. You come along here to 2009. 2009, like I said, was when the Obama administration came out with the Ogden Memorandum about not prosecuting states. And then you come here to 2010-11. This is when concentrates first appeared in the medical dispensaries. Now, in 2009, before the Obama administration said that, we had 5,000 people with medical marijuana cards on the registry. In 2011, we had 119,000. So people, or I guess that was 12. And that was, people flooded to get their marijuana cards. And this is when we legalized recreational. So this is when basically where everything is taking off. But overdose rates took off too. It didn't stop the overdose. So heroin took off, methamphetamine took off, prescription opiates continued to take off. Fentanyl starts to take off here. So marijuana has not helped our opiate overdose deaths. And this is a recent study showing that if they looked at all the things that contribute to opiate use disorder, and they found that the highest contribution was people using marijuana before the age of 18. And to me, this is the biggest study we have, just demonstrating why opiates and marijuana go together as opposed to against each other. This is just a very huge national survey of over 34,000 people. And in wave one, they're asked about cannabis use. And in wave two, they're asked about prescription opiate use. Abuse. And the people that never used cannabis in wave two had almost no opiate use disorder problems. And the more use of marijuana contributed to the more increased opiate use disorder problems. Then we also have this very strange thing happening, which is now flooding emergency rooms in Colorado. This is this idiosyncratic reaction to marijuana. Now, marijuana is supposed to be helpful for nausea, vomiting. However, what we're finding with, and I think it's the reason is because of the high potency causing addiction, people are using more often, so they're using daily, multiple times a day. We are now seeing this idiosyncratic reaction where people are having severe abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting, and they cannot control it. They come into the emergency room screaming and vomiting. That's been coined scromiting. And we have difficulty controlling this. The medications normally used for nausea, vomiting are not working, so people are having to get very powerful drugs like Haldol to try and control the nausea, vomiting. And the only solution is to quit using cannabis. Now, the good thing is there are actually Facebook support group pages now that are awesome, and I totally encourage people to look into them. One that I'm recalling right now is Recovery from Cannabinoid Hyperemesis Syndrome. And it's people that have this that are helping each other, and it's really awesome. But we have one of our ER physicians in Pueblo, Colorado, has been collecting this data because he's been kind of overwhelmed with the number of people coming into the emergency room with this. And now, at this point, 2020, he tells me it's almost every shift. It's somebody almost every shift coming in with this. So we have a serious problem, and I think that we need to do something about it. The only thing I feel I can do is educate. So I've been educating, and we need to increase prevention efforts. And I think that Laura with the Johnny's Ambassadors is doing some really great work in that regard. We need to improve data collection, especially what people are using, because most healthcare facilities, and I work in one, we have the questions for alcohol, tobacco, and drugs. Everybody gets to ask those questions. When I see the patient, I find out they're using marijuana, and that was never on the chart. Well, I ask, well, why did you not say you were using that? Well, they didn't ask me about that because people don't consider marijuana a drug. And so then people are not getting whether they're using high potency concentrates or not. And we need to know that in order to make better decisions about what we're doing. I really do think marijuana, if it's medical, needs to be treated like a medicine. And I think that the doctors recommending it should be required to specify what they are recommending. Is it low amounts of THC, mostly CBD? They should have that written down on some card that they can take to the dispensary so that the bud tenders, who actually really don't have any training at all, can then give it to them without recommending things like concentrates, because I've heard many times people have heard from the bud tenders that the concentrates work better. So if you're using marijuana for pain, you should use the concentrates, more potent. There's no research backing that up. And I do think we should, and there should be some kind of follow-up. I mean, yeah, well, anyway. And then another problem that we have, we need it on like a PDNP, because if you think about it, you cannot go to multiple stores and buy a bunch of Sudafed. You can only buy one Sudafed, and in one store you can only buy one Sudafed. In our medical marijuana system, you can actually buy 2 ounces a day, which is more than in recreational, which is 1 ounce a day. 2 ounces is a lot of product. And there's no monitoring for whether somebody can go to one dispensary at 10 and get 2 ounces, and then another one at 2 and get 2 ounces, and another one at 4 and get 2 ounces. That's a thing called looping. And so we have no ability to control that. And these 18-year-olds are becoming the suppliers in the community because they can get a significant amount of these concentrates. I think we need to cap potency, and we need to eliminate the concentrates from at least medical for sure. There's no research supporting their use. We definitely need increased funding and availability of treatment. And I do think there needs to be more research on CBD and lower doses of THC. A lot of people that I admire, well, that I know that have recommended marijuana are doing what they call microdosing, which is very, very small amounts of THC. And I think there should be a very strong ban on any advertising that appears to be directly related to youth or all drugs. Okay, that's my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions. Oh, well, I guess I have this one last. I just don't want to get in this position. Most of my career has been spent on tobacco, so I've done a lot of research, a lot of publications on tobacco, and I clearly remember this was 1994. All the executives from all the companies, tobacco companies, are standing in front of Congress, raising their right hand, swearing that tobacco was not addicting. This is like insane. And so I think that bottom line, if we can do anything, we have to insist that the cannabis industry acknowledge the possible harms that come from marijuana use. We need to have bud tenders having a license or a certification or something that they've been trained in all the possible harms that have been caused by marijuana. And I want to see a PDMP. Okay.
Excellent. Love those recommendations, and they all need to be done and more. So, Libby, your continued work tirelessly educating and helping people understand the impacts, especially on children, is so admirable, and you are one of my heroes. Let's see, we have some questions coming in. Let's see. Philip, oh, hi, Philip, says, I like the idea of banning advertising. The Lady Bird Johnson Highway Beautification Act is implemented. There's a key provision that says erection or maintenance of the following signs may not be used under federal laws. So it seems to be, you know, that there are provisions for that. And so we need to continue to go after those when seen on highways. It just seems like, Libby, there's just blatant marketing and advertising.
That's absolutely, the cannabis industry has jumped all over that. They have signs everywhere, and it's especially in Pueblo. I mean, because I work there, I know this. almost every road going into Pueblo is covered by cannabis. And so they're able to advertise that way without, putting up their billboards. They're doing such a great service for the community by keeping the roads clean. And, sometimes the roads aren't really clean.
Yeah. And then, parents, have to then be prepared to have conversations with their children when they're in the car and these signs are there, or some of the products that you're showing that just seem to be normal. I think parents can inadvertently communicate that somehow this is normal or harmless, perhaps because they haven't learned from people like you about how different it is today versus the other days, so that they don't have this kind of lackadaisical, I did it when I was a kid, it didn't hurt me. And I think you've laid out very clearly the causes for alarm around mental illness, suicide, ideation, psychosis. So in your work as an addiction psychiatrist and a doctor, how do you suggest that we go about providing education to psychiatrists? I mean, I remember Johnny going to, he had many doctors and psychiatrists, but one in particular told me, if he won't quit using marijuana, tell him to switch strains. Tell him to use sativa, or indigo instead of sativa. And there still is really this disconnect, even in the medical profession, about all of these studies. It's like, don't they read this? Shouldn't
Right.
this be required for them? Shouldn't bud tenders be required to go through these courses and understand these ramifications? How is this going to happen, Libby?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's going to have to be legislated. I mean, yeah, because in my treatment program, when I was we had to move from the state hospital into the community. So I was in Crossroads and we were trying to find a provider for urine drug screens. So I find this provider from Florida who's got pretty good rates, pretty good panels. And so she comes to detail us on the panels, and she tells me, well, I've got 3 panels. One is all the drugs of abuse. The other is all the drugs of abuse plus all the psych drugs we can test for. And then the other one is all the drugs of abuse plus all the psych drugs we can test for, minus marijuana. I said, what? She said, oh yeah, well, we call that our Colorado panel. We've heard from primary care doctors that they don't want to know that their patients are smoking marijuana because they don't know what to do about it.
Wow.
That is awful. That's really awful. I mean, this is a real legitimate company with a panel like that.
And the CDPHE saying to them to not track toxicology. I'm flabbergasted by that. How would we accurately know what this is doing to our children who die by suicide like Johnny? And your numbers don't even include, in fact, I think you were telling me recently, the last data that came out in 2018, it was some 36% of completed suicides in Colorado for youth had THC. But that's the ones that A, did a tox, B, unlike children like Johnny, who were sober for 5 weeks prior to his death, who was still experiencing the psychosis, and yet had no THC in his system, but it was still directly an outcome of the use. I just think that's shameful that we don't have these systems in place to track this data.
I agree.
Let's see. We have a question here. What is the prognosis for recovery? If your son uses and has psychosis, can they recover if they are sober, and for how long versus it will be permanent?
Those are excellent questions, and we just really don't know. I mean, there is data out there that says that if a kid or an adult gets a psychotic reaction to marijuana and they quit, there is a strong possibility they can recover. Like they don't get permanent psychosis.
Like the first time?
Yeah, but they have to stay away from marijuana. And that's been the problem I've seen. I worked with a kid who was 20 and extremely psychotic, requiring 2-month hospitalization on multiple meds to control the psychosis. When I'm seeing him outpatient, he actually was doing really, really well, but having horrible side effects to the antipsychotics. And so we basically tapered him off over a long period of time, all of his antipsychotics, and he was doing really, really well. I mean, he seemed to be back to normal. And I told him, do not go back to using marijuana, period. Well, he came back with his family. They were very upset. He was back to smoking dab, and he was psychotic again. And, I just don't know. I mean, this is why this is so important. People need to get this message that it can definitely cause this, and you just need to stop. It's kind of like with the cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. People are finding that also as well, that if they quit completely, there's a lag time. It takes a while to recover, but they can have full recovery. But if they keep going back to using marijuana, they keep having the symptoms again, and then they get another episode. And
I agree with you. That's in my own observations. That's what we saw with Johnny. After his first suicide attempt from using the dabs for 2 weeks when he went off to college, and he recovered at home beautifully after 3 months of being sober. But it's that vicious cycle that you talked about, Libby, because that cannabis use disorder is so overwhelming unless they are learn new pathways in their brains, new behaviors, exercise, hobbies, engagement, and other things that can create, again, motivation, hope, excitement, happiness. I mean, it seems like there must be a huge behavioral shift. He tried a different university, new environment, new friends, and he was doing so well. And then back to the dabbing. And, I think it's so hard, especially when children are not living at home and they go away to college, and I couldn't duct tape him to the wall and, watch him for the rest of his life. And that it's so hard to keep them sober, and so critically important that they recognize. Let's see, Libby, does it help your advocacy work when parents talk publicly about their experiences with their children's suicide, mental illness, CHS? What is the role of the parent, do you see, in discussing this?
Oh, I think it's a great benefit. And I know it's very difficult, and I don't envy anybody having to do that, but it is something you can do to help other people. And so I think Laura's been doing an awesome job about that. Many people I know, Sally Schindler and Aubrey and all these people have done some really awesome stuff talking about this. And the more we can get people to do that, the better.
Thank you.
Most people that it hasn't happened to them, like you said, are thinking about the old time marijuana. Well, I used to smoke marijuana and it never did anything to me. Well, and they are clueless that this can happen. And I think it's very impacting for people to hear these stories.
Well, I appreciate that. And my mentor, you mentioned Sally and Schindel and Aubrey. I mean, this has been a really great, the only positive outcome I can think of in all of this was an amazing circle of people like you and everyone who's been so helpful. Let's see, have you found that people with ADHD and the Val gene are more susceptible to psychosis if they have cannabis use disorder?
Excellent question. I mean, I don't know. That would be something I'd have to look into the literature. I haven't personally seen that, but I think that's
It's a good question.
a very good question. Yeah.
We did a session, one of Johnny's Ambassadors webinars a couple weeks ago on ADHD. And so that's always something you can go back to our previous recordings and invite you to take a look at that one. Okay, we have time for one more question. How long does it take until you see the symptoms of addiction? Does it take 3 weeks for some of the symptoms of addiction to occur?
Wow. Okay, well that's not an easy answer because there's no cookie cutter thing to this. There are some people that can be addicted the minute they use. There are some people that you have to work at it. And so my take on this is looking at, all different kinds of studies. It depends on the drug. Alcohol, it takes a long time. You have to work at developing your tolerance. You have to really work at becoming an alcoholic. Most people are not addicted the first time they drink. But there are many people that are addicted the first time they smoke a cigarette, from the very first cigarette. And what that has to do with is exposure. And when you're exposed to smoke as a kid, so smoke, any kind of smoke, it's in your brain and it's priming your brain. And that can set you up for addiction. Now, that doesn't cause the addiction. What causes the addiction is when the drug hijacks your reward pathway. But when that happens is when you first engage your prefrontal motor cortex to make a decision to use. And so when you use that drug for the first time, you can be addicted. And I've seen this many times with people in treatment when I'm asking them, why do they smoke cigarettes? When did they start smoking? Why do they smoke? And almost all of them start smoking around puberty. And I'll say, well, why? And they said, I don't know why I started smoking. I hated the fact my parents smoked. They were smoking all the time. And I used to tell them, their cigarettes, throw them in the toilet, all this stuff. I said, well, what happened? Well, when I was 13, my friend gave me a cigarette and I was hooked that minute. And so I can see this like in families where you're growing up in a home where people are smoking marijuana. I mean, this isn't like your family. It takes a while to develop an addiction. But if you're exposed to it and then you choose to use it, I can see how kids can be addicted very quickly.
I was reading something about if a father uses marijuana regularly in front of the children, that they are 90% more likely to use. And if the mother uses, they're 80% more likely to use. So that makes complete sense, especially if you've been around secondhand smoke and the effects of growing up around that all of your life. So yet another reason for our parents to understand the consequences of marijuana on their children. Well, Libby, again, thank you. This is your second time back by popular demand, and I know we will see much more of you in the future. We really appreciate the gift of your time, your talent, your expertise, and thank you for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
Thanks for joining us. All right, talk to you soon. Bye-bye.